Okay, the next document we're going to talk about is the Articles of Confederation. And up until this point, um, the Second Continental Congress actually acted as our government. So during the wartime, they were the ones that were in charge. But once the war ends with the Battle of Yorktown in October of 1781, we have to establish a brand new government. We've won the war, so now we have to create an actual government to run our country. So that is the Articles of Confederation. What a confederacy is, that's different than what our government is, and make sure that you get this in your notes. A confederation is what they called it was a firm league of friendship between 13 colonies. And what's specifically different about the colonies then, or the states then under the Articles of Confederation, and the states now under the Constitution, the states, if you'll notice, I used the small s, the lowercase s, and I did that on purpose, using this right here as opposed to a capital, because the states remained and retained their sovereignty. They were free, they were independent. So that is different than what we have now. Make sure that you put in your notes that we are now a federal government. And so that's really the difference in terms of where the power lies. In a confederacy, the states are independent, they are sovereign, and they come together for just a few things like national security, those sorts of things. But we have a federal government. The power doesn't lie with the states. They actually share power as opposed to one being more powerful than the other. The states are almost on an equal plane as what the national government is. So under the Confederacy, I'm going to say it one more time. The states are sovereign, and the central government is beneath them. They can suggest things to them, but the states are sovereign, so they can decide whether to follow what the federal government is doing, or the central government. I shouldn't say federal, it would be a central government. Under our Constitution, we are a federal government. The states and the central or the federal government in Washington, D.C. are basically on the same plane. Now, if there is a conflict between the two of them, the federal government has supremacy, and when we start looking at the Constitution, we'll see that outlined there. Governments under the Articles, make sure you get all this information, and we'll talk about when we start looking at the Constitution how these are different. The Articles of Confederation established one branch of government. They only had a legislature, and they called it Congress, and their responsibility was to make laws. What it did not include was an executive or a judicial branch. Now, I need to clarify this because there was a president in Congress, but he had no real official duties other than he was the presiding officer. He held the gavel, and if he called you to order or called on you or different things like that, but he didn't have any of the powers of what we know our president has today. So if you hear someone talking about we actually had a president under the Articles of Confederation, they were actually part of Congress, chosen by Congress, and they were just the presiding officer. So there was no executive branch to enforce the laws, and there was no judicial branch to settle disputes between the states, so to be some unbiased interpretation of the law. So looking specifically at this legislative branch, it was a unicameral legislature, and we know that means there was one house, and it was called Congress. Their presiding officer in that was called the president, but he was not an executive. Every state in this Congress received one vote, so it didn't matter what the population was. So your large states that were heavily populated, Virginia, had the same vote as what a very small state with few people living in it, like Rhode Island. And once again, that becomes very important later when we look at the creation of our Constitution. So they had one House legislature called Congress, and every state had equal representation. Every state got one vote. Make sure you know that each state could send up to 7 delegates. So if Virginia wanted to send 7, they could. But it didn't matter how many delegates you had. You could have 2 delegates, you could have 7 delegates. They all had to agree, and they only got one vote. Powers that were included under this legislature was they had the power to make war and peace. They had the power to enter into treaties with other countries, and they had the power, and notice I have in all caps, to ask states for money. And again, lowercase s. These were sovereign states. You could ask them, but the states were not required to give money. So once again, we're looking at a confederacy that's typically there for national security type issues, and everything else was left to the states. So we should see some weaknesses here. If you only have a legislative branch and no executive or judicial branch, you have no way to enforce laws, and you have no way to settle disputes. If you have a dispute between two states, there's no way to do that, so you don't have a branch to interpret what the laws are. Another weakness under the Articles of Confederation was you had to have 13 of the 13 states to amend it. And amending just means to make changes to the document. So if you wanted to make changes to this document, because once again, we are 13 sovereign states, and you shouldn't be able to force us to do something that we don't want to do, and we'll see the difference in that when we start looking at the Constitution. So if you're going to, you cannot make me do something against my will because I'm sovereign. So it took all of the states to make changes to the Articles of Confederation. So just know that the Articles of Confederation were never amended. They did not have the power to tax either. So they could ask the states to give money, but they could not force them. And they also did not have the power to regulate interstate trade. So if you had goods that you wanted to sell somewhere else in another state, there was no regulating that. So if you wanted to go through, if you had to go through two states to get to the state you were going to, you might have to pay a tax to get in the state as soon as you cross the state line. So literally, this was a very, very big issue. You had states who were, each one of them were creating their own money. So trade was very difficult because as soon as you entered another state, you may or may not have the money or the currency. They were printing it at will. So inflation was a problem because there was so much money being printed at that time. So obviously there's a need for change. Shays' Rebellion is a rebellion that was led by Daniel Shay, and you're actually going to watch a short video over this, but you definitely need to know, and you'll understand this as soon as you watch the short video clip that you'll have on the day you take your quiz, that Shays' Rebellion is significant because it leads them to realize that the government that they have established under the Articles of Confederation is not significant to take care of the issues that they're having domestically or within the borders. The war has not been over for very long, and it would be very easy for England to come back in and try and start it up again, or another country for that matter, to come in and start a war and try to take over again. So because of Shays' Rebellion and what happened with that, there were some delegates, some different people who felt there should be a meeting, and they did schedule a meeting for Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the purpose was specifically for revising the Articles of Confederation. So when you get the delegates coming from these various states, the only thing that they were given permission to do was to revise the Articles of Confederation. They did not have permission to write a new constitution. So 12 of the 13 states send delegates. Rhode Island does not send any delegates to this meeting. And this meeting eventually becomes known as the Constitutional Convention, and it is where the Constitution is written.